North Carolina wants out of the ACC. What does that mean for Miami? It's pretty complicated.
You are Locked On College Football, your daily podcast on all things college football. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Locked On College Football. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view every day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and your daily source to stay up to date with the biggest stories in the greatest sport on planet Earth. Realignment, coaching carousel, the portal, and more. We've always got you covered. We've got Alex Donno of Locked On Canes joining me here for today's first segment. We'll talk Clemson a little bit later, and then a couple of FanDuel line changes that really caught my eye in the last few days. But Donald, let's start with the Hurricanes. This is a complicated situation for Miami. Now, some people in the comments, I'm sure, will say it's simple. They've got to get out of the ACC. But North Carolina saying we want out is not a simple, well, let's just bring Miami with us. Because as Isaac Shade of Locked On Tar Heels talked about on yesterday's show, there is a tie driven by the legislature to NC State. And realignment moves happen in even numbers, not odd numbers. So when you saw the North Carolina Board of Trustee member say, we either have to get out or renegotiate, what was your reaction as to what you think Miami needs to do?
There's definitely some FOMO, right? Because all these Clemson lawsuits, Florida State lawsuits, North Carolina hasn't taken that plunge yet. But, you know, when one of their prominent trustees throws out quotes like he threw out about advocating for a move out of the ACC. Covering this from a Miami side, honestly, there's not been much to cover because very little has been said about this. Miami is, whatever they're thinking, they've kept it very close to the vest, to the point where I know for a lot of Miami fans, the inaction and the passive approach to this, at least on the surface, has gotten frustrating, because a lot of Miami fans would wonder, like, you know, how come Miami's not talking about wanting to get out? How come they're not talking about how unfavorable the ACC's grant of rights and the TV revenue is? I feel like they probably believe it to be unfair behind the scenes. You know, I've referenced this already a couple times on your show, Spencer. I've referenced it on my shows as well, that really the only public comment we've had on the matter was Miami athletic director Dan Radakovich back in March did a local radio interview on WQAM in Miami, and basically, at least publicly, supported the ACC, you know, mentioned we are strong with the ACC, which was something a lot of Miami fans didn't want to hear. But then another thing that Miami's athletic director did mention and kind of imply, if we rewind a year, Spencer, you know, when it was starting to become clear that a handful of schools were frustrated with the revenue gap that the ACC was going to be facing. I mean, a handful of schools within the ACC. There were 7 universities. They were nicknamed by Brett McMurphy of Action Network as the Magnificent Seven, who inquired and took a look at the ACC's grant of rights, because the ACC's grant of rights agreement, it's kept in a locked room. It cannot be photographed. You have to have, like, basically a chaperone with you when you look at it. I'm sure that there are, you know, people would say, oh, well, it must be because it's this shady document. Maybe, but I think...
Well, that's what the Florida State Attorney General, I think, is getting her name into the fold for, is she's saying, hey, you can't keep this behind lock. Like, this needs to be a visible document that we can all go and see. But then even if they see that, like Miami's response is going to be what exactly?
Well, because and apparently Miami did at least take a look at it. Again, you can't make copies of it, you can't photograph it, but they did take a look at it, and it sounds as though, and this is, I have to take some implications on this because Radakovich was not really that specific on it. It sounds like whatever they took a look at, they felt like there's not really an easy, clear way out here, and maybe they feel like the grant of rights is ironclad. I don't know if it is or isn't, Spencer, because clearly Florida State and Clemson feel like even if the lawyers may say it's ironclad, where there's a will, there's a way. Our mission is to find a way out of it, and we will find a way even if we have to manufacture a way out of it. Miami has not taken that public approach. But when you talk about it, and we know it's only a matter of time, whether it's a matter of months or years, at some point in the not so distant future, Florida State and Clemson they're going to leave the ACC. Like, it's going to happen. And with the comments made coming out of Chapel Hill, it's becoming increasingly likely that North Carolina may be interested in leaving, and they would take what people refer to as the Wolfpack backpack with them. They would take NC State with them out of the conference.
That's brutal.
And if that were to happen, the ACC is severely diminished. And you would look at it from a Miami point of view and say, like, okay, I guess maybe you still would have the college football playoff tie in with the conference winner, assuming they don't renegotiate that.
I don't know. That could get stripped.
Right? And then you would have the growing revenue gap, because ESPN would surely blow up and probably redo the TV deal. And you would be at such a disadvantage. And then there are also the questions of, if you're talking about Florida State, Clemson, perhaps NC State and North Carolina all leaving the ACC, if that were to all happen, does the conference implode? And obviously, if it imploded, Miami would be forced to. And I think, to be fair, I believe they're probably doing their due diligence behind the scenes. I don't think they are as inactive as they appear on the surface. There's probably some things happening behind the scenes in at least examining the landscape. But really, if the conference were to implode, Miami would be forced to do something, whether it's try to get a Power 2 bid, or I know our pal Drake Toll talks a lot about potential Big 12 expansion, and he's said it repeatedly. He believes Miami would be at the top of the Big 12's list. I don't think that's what Miami fans would really want. I think they would.
I disagree with Drake on that one. I don't think the Big 12 is. I think it'd be a fallback. Can't find anything else. And I don't know that Miami would be unable to find a home. And the other Miami angle I want your thoughts on here, Donno, is the second part of the quote that I discussed on yesterday's show with Isaac. And that's, hey, we have to either get into the Power 2 or renegotiate the deal in the ACC. If Florida State and Clemson leave and they go, let's say, to the Big 10, and everybody else is left over, and you could renegotiate the ACC deal and get more than you're currently getting. Is that a viable path for Miami in your view?
Short term, it's not a long-term path, I don't believe. So here's there would be, at least temporarily, there would be extra money, because that would come from two places, Spencer. If there are fewer teams in the conference, then yeah, you have a bigger piece of the pie for the teams who remain, or 15 teams, 12 teams remaining, depending on how many. There's 17 in the ACC right now. So you theoretically get a bigger piece of the pie. Plus, I know that Florida State and Clemson lawyers would like you to believe they can leave the conference for free. That's not realistic. It's probably going to be at least a couple $100 million a piece to get out. So then with that couple $100 million, you would think, well, yeah, right. But they would do, let's say, $500 million for those teams to leave. That would lead to increased payouts from that pool of money to the remaining schools. So, but at the same time, are we playing checkers or are we playing 4D chess? Like, do the teams that would remain in the ACC, would they say, okay, you know what? Maybe for the next 4 or 5 years, there's a little bit more revenue than we have right now. So maybe we take that and we're somewhat happy with it. But then, within the next 4 or 5 years, and I'm just spitballing here on the timelines. That's just, and, I'm just making conversation with that. Maybe we think about it in the long term. Can we find another landing spot? So, yeah, maybe increased revenue and a settlement from Florida State and Clemson leaving, that might keep the remaining teams happy for the short term. But at the same time, in the long term, the Power 2 would be getting stronger. The ACC would be getting weaker. I don't believe a school like Miami would look at that and say, this is a stable situation for the next 5, 8, 10 years. I think you would have to have other irons in the fire and plans to do something else.
Yeah, especially a place that has invested in a coach, that has invested in facilities, in NIL collectives, the way that Miami has, the way they've invested in the transfer portal. You and I have talked about, in the football sense, their kind of all-in approach, and it feels like they're capable of being that sort of team year in, year out. It's a lot harder to do that if you don't have a seat at the table. You ever see the movie The Big Short?
I like that movie.
Yeah, one of my favorite movies of all time. Charlie and Jamie and Charlie need to get an ISDA agreement, or else they can't sit at the big kids table. That's what Miami's looking for. If you can't have a seat there, then you don't get to play. And I think that's where Miami's head has to be. And I agree with you because I get plenty of comments from Miami fans. They're not doing enough. Why are they sitting on that? I think they're just not being public with it. I cannot imagine they're looking at this realignment landscape and just going, nothing to see here. Are we supposed to be doing something? Should we be aware of it? That would be the highest level of incompetence. And I just don't think that the Miami would get to that level.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Either, because the way that I look at it, obviously different schools are handling it a different way. I wonder if like anyone within, the administrative offices at North Carolina are like pretty upset about those quotes that came out. Because to me, the way that I look at it, if you're actually ready to sue the ACC, then you say what you have to say publicly. If you're not ready to do that, I believe you have to toe the line publicly, which is what Miami's doing. And again, I don't have any reason to believe Miami's about to sue the ACC, but when you're not suing the ACC, I believe it's in your best interest to say, the right things publicly and not, disparage the conference if you're not ready to sue them. So that's what I feel is going on. I think they're saying what they need to say publicly. What's happening privately, I wish I could be a fly on the wall.
Alex Donno, Locked on Canes and Locked on ACC. Donno, appreciate it as always.
Always a great time. Thank you for having me.
Speaking of Clemson, without the portal, are they doomed to fail and regress this year? We'll talk about that next. Before we get to Clemson, let's get to eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience, the formula for winning championships, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Clemson and Colorado have one thing in common. Two things. They both play college football, and they both start with the letter C. That is where these program similarities begin and end. Thank you. Come again. So Clemson has added a whopping 0 transfer portal players in the 2024 cycle. And Dabo Swinney has been adamant that he wants to remain old school, that he wants to cater directly to those fans, many of whom leave comments on my shows routinely, that the old way was the best way. The only way to really play true, honest to goodness, patriotic, real American way American football is without the transfer portal and not having all these mercenaries and free agency gone wild in college football. He's putting that to the test. And I think it's easy from the outset to look at Clemson and say, well, that's not going to work. Well, that's doomed to fail. That depends on how you define failure. Because Dabo Swinney last year and Clemson won 9 games, 8 in the regular season. Some of you don't care about bowl season. I'm not one of those individuals. Clemson was a 9-win team. I can assure you Kentucky was trying to win that game, and Clemson was able to get it done. And so Clemson this year has added 0 transfers, and they have had 13 players leave. Now, if you just look at those two numbers, you would think Clemson is going to be an utter disaster with their roster this year. That is simply not the case. Vegas doesn't think that's the case, as we'll discuss a little bit later on. But Clemson's roster is still one of the 15 to 20 best in all of college football. Would it be enhanced by opening the doors to transfer portal players? Yes, absolutely, particularly at the wide receiver position. But have they lost just swaths and swaths of players to the portal that were impact players last year? Is their roster completely depleted? The answer to that question is a definitive no. And I got the numbers to back it up. So, the last 3 cycles, 22, 23, and 24, Clemson's high school recruiting classes have ranked 10th, 11th, and 11th. That is not bad. Also, I would like to remind you that Clemson was an 8-4 team last year, and they were 0-2 in overtime games. 0-2. If they win one of those, does that feel different? What if they win both? Those are 50-50 coin toss games. They happen to lose both of them. So take that for whatever you'd like. Nebraska fans, I'm sure, have their own opinions on the matter. But Cade Klubnik is back at quarterback. I think he's tremendously talented. He's got his head coach, Dabo Swinney, back. He's got his offensive coordinator and Garrett Riley back. That's my favorite combination. It's why I can't write off Clemson. But the roster construction is another reason that I can't write them off. But when you've got coach, head coach, OC, and quarterback returning, that is a fairly, not entirely, but that is a fairly unique formula in today's world of college football, where players leave, they run out of eligibility, coaches leave, and whatnot. Klubnik was not great last year. Was not bad, for sure, but can improve. Pro Football Focus had him graded around 64. That seems a little low to me. But would I put him in the 80-90 range if I were giving him a PFF grade? No, I would not, based on what I saw from Cade Klubnik last year. And it's reasonable to think in his second full year of starting at quarterback, he's going to be a better player. He's got good coaching around him. Does he have great weapons around him? Well, we know he has a good running back in Phil Maffa. That guy, that's a football player right there. So I don't think Clemson's going to have any issues running the football. Well, Spencer, what about their offensive line? Do they have any talent in that? I'm so glad you asked. Clemson certainly has one or two spots along the offensive line that might be up for grabs, that are getting played out during spring football, and maybe they'll decide during fall camp. But you've got 4 or 5 guys that were either starters or rotation players last year that logged many hundreds of snaps for Clemson's offensive line last year who are back this season. That's the bulk of the big boys up front, who again are following a more traditional career trajectory. You come in as true freshmen, you sit for a year or two, then you start to get your snaps, and then you start to get better. And now's the year where Clemson would like to see some of those guys put it all together. So that's where their roster is starting out. That is a strong foundation. Good coaching, capable quarterback, great running back, and an expected, at least experienced offensive line that I'd expect to be good. So that's a good place to start. Now, the questions are on the perimeter, because last year they returned Tyler Brown at wide receiver, who had over 500 yards receiving last year. They lost Bo Collins, though. He hit the transfer portal. And I think if you talk about Clemson's transfer portal strategy and say, well, who did they actually lose? What are the guys that are really making an impact? 13 outgoing players. I saw 2 that made a legitimate impact last year. Bo Collins, over 500 yards receiving, almost 40 receptions. That's a loss. And that's the sort of loss that, boy, it feels like Clemson should be able to just go out and get a transfer dish. But remember, they're not recruiting 0-star kids. They're bringing in a bevy of blue chip prospects. They have a 5-star wideout in the 2024 class. We'll see if he's ready to contribute as a true freshman come this fall. But if you lose a guy like Bo Collins, other programs would traditionally say, let's bring in a transfer. Let's bring in a guy who we know can produce at that sort of level, and we have no drop-off. Clemson feels like they can just develop somebody to play in that sort of role, and we'll see how it works out. The other loss is Andrew Makuba. He transferred to Texas. Longhorns have had a great offseason. Great offseason in the transfer portal. And Andrew Makuba is one of the players why. He's not the only one. You bring in guys like Isaiah Bond from Alabama, Silas Bolden from Oregon State, amongst others. Makuba's a good football player. 4th leading tackler for Clemson a year ago. Okay, that's a loss. That's a loss. A 500-yard receiver and your 4th leading tackler at safety. Those are the biggest impact transfer departures from Clemson's transfer portal outgoing class this year. So don't get fooled into thinking, wow, 13 gone and none coming in. Well, only 2 of those guys made a real significant impact, and they made an impact, no doubt about it. But Clemson, I think, is going to be able to recover those particular losses, and Vegas agrees. So, betting lines, which we'll talk about more later in the show, has got Clemson's win total at 9.5. Now, does that mean they're a national title contender? Perhaps not in the eyes of the odds makers, because week 1, they have to play a neutral site game in Atlanta against Georgia, which is essentially a road game, they're almost a 2-touchdown underdog, 13.5. We'll learn a lot about Clemson in that particular game. We won't learn everything, though. We will not learn how many games Clemson is scheduled to win in that particular game, because you are going to be working some new guys into the rotation at various spots. You are going to have Cade Klubnik still trying to find his way to reach his full ceiling. I've got a hot take. He's not going to have the best game of his career against Kirby Smart and Georgia down in Atlanta. Just a thought. But it's not all bad news in the betting sense for Clemson here. I think this number's too large, personally. They're 8.5-point favorites at home against NC State and Dave Doran. I think that's too many. That's too many. But Vegas thinks they're deserving of that. That's a big number. Over a touchdown? Over a touchdown and the hook against NC State. I don't know if Clemson wins that game by more than 7 or 8 points. I might lean right now towards the Wolfpack, who I think have done a great job in this offseason to make themselves the best they can be for 2024. I think they're going to be an 8-10 win team. Now, Florida State, conversely, if you want an encapsulation of how Vegas feels about Clemson's roster and their ability to compete, at Florida State, who have gone bonkers in the portal. They've had a fantastic, busy offseason in the transfer portal. Florida State just a 3.5-point home favorite over Clemson. It's not a big number. It's not a big number. So, Clemson's transfer portal numbers don't look good. Their roster is still going to be one of the 15 to 20 best in all of college football. They could be aided by the transfer portal, no doubt. But is this thing bound to fail? I don't see it. Let me know your thoughts in the YouTube comments. And speaking of betting lines, did you see what Vegas did with the LSU-Bama game? We'll talk about that next. First, let's talk about our friends at Game Time. Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace of the NBA, which makes getting playoff tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to tip-off. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets. You can save up to 60%, which is more than half last time I checked, though I'm not a math major, so maybe I'm off there, but you can save up to 60% buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, etc. Save even more with exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game or event. Just take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app and get your NBA tickets by creating an account. Use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE. That's LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. I enjoy poking around our friends at FanDuel, official sportsbook of Locked On, of course. And I saw something the other day that made me go, ooh, someone's not going to like that. So, of course, we're talking about it here on the show, right? Duh. LSU minus 2.5 at home against Alabama. This is essentially saying on a neutral field, it's roughly an even line. LSU has revamped their defensive staff going into 2024, as was desperately needed after that was maybe the worst LSU defense I have ever seen for an entire season of my lifetime. They've always had great defenses, and they've kind of flipped the script there in Baton Rouge. Doesn't mean they can't be good, because they absolutely can be, but they haven't exactly hit on every transfer target they were looking for along the defensive line. They wanted to get Dominic Williams. He went to Oklahoma instead. Does he go to Oklahoma if they're not going to the SEC? I don't know. You tell me. Just kind of food for thought. But certainly I expect LSU's defense to be better. Is the offense going to be as good as it was last year? I don't know how it possibly can be. Of course they're going to be talented. Of course they've got guys. Garrett Nussmeier could be great for all I know. Is he going to win the Heisman Trophy? No, which means you're not going to have as good of a quarterback as last year. Are you going to have two receivers as good as Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas? You tell me, Tigers fans, do you have two guys that you feel as good about as those two dudes? Because those two were dudes, big time dudes. So favoring LSU over Alabama, which has certainly undergone its fair share of turnover from a year ago. To me, for those who don't have personal experience with Kalen DeBoer, allow me to explain how it works going against him. On paper, you should win. You've got the better roster, maybe you're even at home, and then you just don't. That's it. That's how it goes. So this will be the worst Alabama team Kalen DeBoer coaches, and their win total is still 9.5. They may very well end up in the college football playoff. If he gets the most out of Jalen Milroe at quarterback, Alabama will be very good. Alabama will be very, very good. They still have a lot of talent over there. Yes, a lot of guys have left. This is true. They are not short on talent compared to where they were when DeBoer first got there. They have made transfer portal moves, and they have got probably one of I would not put them in the top 5. They're probably inside the top 10 best rosters in college football, and they've got maybe the best game day coach in college football in Kalen DeBoer. If you don't know what his record is, it's like 113-12. That's his career record as a head coach. He doesn't go through adjustment years. So that line, Jalen Milroe or Garrett Nussmeier. Well, maybe because you're in Baton Rouge for this game, LSU should be favored. I don't know about that one. Here's another one I don't know about. Ohio State hosting Michigan this year. Boy, Ohio State's got to win that game. They've got to win that game. Sharon Moore has never been a full-time head coach. They don't know who they're starting at now. Ohio State doesn't know who they're starting at quarterback either. But Michigan knows even less about what they're doing at quarterback right now as spring football has essentially all but wrapped up. They've lost a lot of guys, and they have not had the sort of offseason that Ohio State has had. Buckeyes 9.5-point favorites. Woof. Oof. Michigan fans not going to like hearing that one very much because that's a big, giant, that is a humongous line. That game's in Columbus. I don't know if Ohio State loses that football game. I also don't know if they're winning that game by double digits. Michigan's defense is going to be very good. I have questions about the offense because I don't really know. I know that Donovan Edwards is going to run the football. I know Sharon Moore schemes a ground game exceptionally well. I know they've got plenty of talent along the offensive line, though they're replacing several pieces. I know all that about Michigan. I still need to know what you're doing at quarterback because you're not going to, shall we say, Penn State, Ohio State. What do I mean? 7 consecutive runs? You're not doing that against Ohio State. Not with that defense, not with the returners and the guys they brought in. That's just not going to happen. Caleb Downs individually might not let that happen. So I think that for Ohio State to be a 9.5-point favorite, Vegas likes something about what they did this spring. They must like quarterback questions, I suppose. Here's the last one to talk about. Georgia has gone up as a favorite at Ole Miss. They're a 5.5-point favorite in Oxford. Woof. Pun half intended because they're the Bulldogs, of course. So I have been adamant for a long time here on this show. Georgia should be the number 1 preseason team. Georgia should be the favorites in the SEC. Georgia should be the favorites to win the title. They are the betting favorites, according to FanDuel, to win the title here. I'm not sure what drives a 2-point line movement here to go from Georgia minus 3.5, which to me felt about right, at Ole Miss. This game is in Oxford, and I have been as high on the Rebels as anybody because I think Ole Miss is a playoff team this year. I think they are a 10-win team minimum. That's where Ole Miss should be. You've got your quarterback returning. You've got a litany of weapons. They have had the number 1 transfer portal class, according to 24/7 Sports. Ole Miss should be one of the best teams in the SEC. And they feel like a team that's got to strike while the iron's hot because this is the worst that Alabama's going to be. We don't know what Garrett Nussmeier is necessarily at LSU. I think he could be good, but do we know Mike Elko, first year at Texas A&M? Again, they've brought in a great transfer portal class. Is it all coming together this year? History would say it's not going to just magically appear, but it could. But it could. And Ole Miss has got key returners. They've got their head coach in place. They've got a great transfer portal class. All those factors line up to make you think, okay, Ole Miss has got to go and attack this season and make the absolute most out of it that they can. Georgia, a 5.5-point favorite in Oxford, again, feels like a big number. Now, I disagreed with the premise of all three of those lines. LSU being favored over Bama, even at home, or at least by, over 2 points. That feels like it should be closer to a pick 'em maybe. Ohio State 9.5, that feels like a big number. Georgia 5.5. Those three teams are not going 0-3 as favorites against the spread. Just think about that. They could go 1-2, but the likelihood they go 0-3, not very high. So what? Either Georgia's beating Ole Miss by 6 or more, Ohio State's beating Michigan by 10 or more, or LSU beats Alabama. Now, on the surface, that would seem like the most likely game in which the favorite covers because it's the smallest line. I don't think that's the case. I feel a little bit better, not a lot, but a little bit better about Alabama right now than LSU. So I go to the other two, and I'm trying to ask myself, Ohio State getting its revenge now that Harbaugh is gone, or Georgia being every bit as good as I expect them to be? Which of those two things do you think is more likely to happen? Kind of an interesting question. And frankly, I don't know if I have an answer to that question right now. But posing interesting questions this time of year, that's what May is for. Appreciate everyone listening. I'll see you next time. And until then, hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.